The trouble kicked off right at 9:07 a.m. on a Saturday when Marlene Withers, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA, came storming onto my beach cabin porch sporting a sequin sun hat, clutching a clipboard, and demanding I hand over my place for what she called her sacred annual brunch tradition. I was smack in the middle of slicing a mango barefoot while the tide whispered against the stilts under my cabin, still rocking my sleep shirt and an expression that said, "Please, not now." And she was already barking at somebody over her shoulder to haul the chafing dishes up the steps quick before the mimosas lose their chill. I blinked at her, wondering if I'd slept through some kinda declared state of emergency that let folks temporarily grab private beachfront property in the name of deed eggs and HOA politics. That was the moment I figured out two things. First, Marlene had no clue I wasn't the previous owner anymore. And second, she totally thought the brunch gave her divine right of entry. So I said, no. That single word hit harder than a gull smashing into a glass patio door. No, I repeated, slow and polite. This is my cabin now, and no brunches were approved. And right there, Marlene Withers, 5-term president of the South Tide Dunes Homeowners Association, flinched like I'd smacked her with a smoked salmon platter. She stammered something about community tradition, about social unity, about her personal chef who was already assembling quiches. But I stood firm. A minute later, she turned purple, screamed, "You'll regret this," and stormed off in a theatrical swirl of lemon-colored linen while dealing someone on speakerphone. That's when the drone showed up. And no, I don't mean metaphorically. An actual drone hovering over my porch, buzzing like an angry mechanical hornet with a GoPro strapped to its belly. Marlene apparently had called in air surveillance. I hadn't even brushed my teeth yet. The thing about beach towns is that folks assume sand softens conflict. They imagine everybody barefoot and chilled out, sipping fruity drinks while seagulls cry overhead. But conflict doesn't vanish at the ocean. It just wears brighter clothes. Marlene's attack came wrapped in beach-themed pastel, but it hit like a brick in a piñata. I'd only bought the cabin 3 months ago, a spot I'd fallen head over heels for cause of its weathered charm and lack of neighbors within shouting distance. That was until I found out the HOA here operated more like a local aristocracy, and Marlene was the ruling monarch. No sooner had I unpacked than I started getting notes, not letters. Notes written in all caps, printed in Comic Sans, folded and slipped under my door or shoved into my mailbox by an invisible hand. Notes like "Can's not out before 6 a.m. or "Please trim your dune grass to approved height" or "Where is your community pride?" I'd ignored choose in to let time and logic cool whatever fire the HOA ran on. But today was different cause today apparently was the holy brunch. The brunch was something I'd heard of in whispers, a once-a-year spectacle where HOA board members and hand-picked residents gathered in some unfortunate member's home to celebrate themselves. This year, it was supposed to be in mine. Unbeknownst to me, the previous owner, an elderly poet who had since retired to the mountains, had hosted the event the last 5 years. The HOA had mistaken that hospitality for tradition and that tradition for entitlement. Marlene had built her entire social image around it. And now I just shattered her sacred timeline with a single mango-stained handwave. She didn't take it well. By noon, I'd become the main character in the HOA group chat, which I was not a member of, but had been shown via screenshots by the kindly neighbor 3 cabins down, Mrs. Higgs, who kept an illegal chicken and a moral compass sharper than most church deacons. Marlene was demanding an emergency board vote to review my non-compliant community attitude and had apparently called the sheriff's non-emergency line to report a domestic event of civil disorder. The brunch, meanwhile, had been relocated in a huff to the narrow deck of Marlene's own house 2 streets inland, which had no ocean view and was, according to Mrs. Higgs, barely big enough to host a poker night, let alone a power brunch. The guests arrived expecting sunlit coastal ambience, and instead were greeted with wilted hydrangeas and the sound of leaf blowers. I watched it all unfold from my porch hammock with a glass of orange juice and a smug seagull perched nearby like a sentry. That evening, things escalated. A letter arrived, not a note this time. A formal letter on HOA letterhead hand-delivered by a trembling teenager who mumbled he was only doing it for extra credit. It stated I was now under review for 3 violations. 1. Obstructing a sanctioned community event. 2. Failing to maintain appropriate beach porch decor. And 3. Demonstrating conduct unbecoming of a community resident. I wasn't sure what that last one meant, but I figured it was the HOA version of disrespect in the crown. I laughed, but only until I opened my email and saw photos from a fake brunch posted to the HOA website under the caption, "Our beautiful tradition continues." There in the pictures were my porch steps, my cabin's paint color, even a glimpse of my wind chimes. But the brunch hadn't happened there. It was a digital Frankenstein, a brunch built from recycled photos, carefully edited to preserve the illusion of control. Marlene had gone full North Korea. I was furious, but also intrigued. Marlene had clearly made a miscalculation. She thought I was temporary, some clueless out-of-towner with no spine for coastal politics. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 10 years as a freelance legal researcher and 5 more working in property litigation before I decided enough was enough and traded suits for sandals. I didn't fight loud. I fought smart. And now I had a target. My first move was simple. I started reading not beach novels, not cookbooks. I read the HOA charter. All 83 pages of it tucked behind a dusty login wall filled with outdated clauses, contradictory bylaws, and legal loopholes wide enough to drive a brunch cart through. Marlene had built her empire on people not reading. I was about to flip that script. Later that week, as retaliation for my so-called brunch betrayal, Marlene tried to have my driveway reclassified as common property. A neon cone appeared one morning with a laminated sign that read, "Reserved for HOA use only." I moved it. She replaced it. I parked my kayak on it. She sent someone to tag it with orange tape. I left her a note written in Comic Sans that said, "Thanks for the decoration." The war was on. Only one of us was wearing flip-flops, and it wasn't her. But what really made me realize just how deep this was gonna go wasn't the brunch or the drone or the fake photos. It was what I found behind an old cabinet in the shed 2 nights later. A stack of folders, dusty but carefully labeled, left behind by the poet who used to own the place. Inside, printouts of Marlene's emails, minutes from unrecorded meetings, and a handwritten note that read, "If you're reading this, you've pissed her off. Welcome to the resistance." I sat there under a single bulb, Logan, until tears fell into my coffee. I wasn't just up against an HOA president. I'd inherited a legacy war, and I was gonna finish it quietly, legally, and with more style than any brunch could ever muster. The next morning began with the sound of footsteps crunching across the shell-strewn gravel outside my window, followed by a strange buzzing that made the hairs on my arms twitch. I peeked through the blinds to find 2 guys in matched polos and cargo shorts stepping carefully over the edge of my garden beds, armed with clipboards and one of those long poles with a mirror on the end that usually only show up in airport security lines. One of them muttered something about a fence post, while the other took a picture of my air conditioner unit from a crouched position that made him look like a wildlife photographer tracking an elusive species of suburban duck. They were the HOA inspectors, or as I later learned through Mrs. Higgs's whispered commentary from behind her bird feeder, they were 2 of Marlene's nephews, both recently laid off from a failed cryptocurrency startup and now working under her newly invented Community Property Integrity Squad. This was her next move, and she wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. The war had gone from brunch to bureaucracy, and the battlefield was my soil, my sidden. And judging by the absurdly official-looking document they stuck in my screen door, my compost pile, the violation list they handed over was printed on thick ivory paper, as if formality could hide the ridiculousness beneath. It accused me of such grave offenses as using unapproved outdoor furniture, harboring invasive plant species, and failing to maintain porch charm consistent with neighborhood spirit. What did that even mean? Was there a federally recognized porch charm rating system I hadn't been briefed on? Did Marlene have a rubric? I flipped the page and saw photos attached. One of my recycled driftwood bench, one of a wild blackberry vine curling through the fence, and most mysteriously, one blurry close-up of what appeared to be a dead seagull on my doormat. I blinked. I had never seen that bird before, but there it was, right next to my sandals, wings folded like a tragic paper airplane, eyes glazed in digital HD. I went outside immediately, searching the porch, but the bird was gone. Nothing. No feathers, no outline, not even a smell. I checked the surrounding sand and found only clean emptiness and a few of Mrs. Higgs's rogue chickens dust bathing under my stairs like it was business as usual. That's when I realized the seagull was a plant. Not the literal kind, but the kind used in courtroom drama shows. Evidence that's been staged. Marlene had either placed a bird carcass on my porch for photo purposes or digitally inserted it into the image to build a case. Either way, she was a skeleton. It would have been easy to feel rattled, but I had already started documenting everything. A weatherproof camera was now tucked discreetly in the carved mermaid statue by the mailbox. Another installed behind a decorative crab on the balcony rail, and one cleverly disguised inside an old potted aloe vera. The night before, I'd captured footage of Marlene's nephews trying to peer into my windows while pretending to look for sidewalk cracks. One of them tripped and fell into the lavender bushes, his yelp sharp and satisfying. I saved the clip immediately and uploaded a copy to a secure drive labeled HOA Shenanigans. What Marlene didn't know was that every one of her tactics was being logged, dated, and prepared for the biggest counterstrike she'd ever experienced. And while she spent her time crafting fake violations and resurrecting brunches that never were, I was spending my nights reading up on municipal law, filming B-roll for what might become the strangest documentary in coastal history, and drafting emails to an old friend of mine who now worked in the county zoning office. By midweek, things had begun to spiral even further. A new rule was slipped under every door in the HOA community statin that residents were now required to submit written requests for porch modifications, which included everything from seasonal wreaths to the color of patio cushions. Apparently my beach chair striped navy and white was deemed too nautical and not in alignment with the community's evolving aesthetic vision. Evolving aesthetic vision. The same neighborhood that still had 3 inflatable flamingos and a mailbox shaped like a manatee. I could hardly take it seriously. But it wasn't just absurd. It was weaponized absurdity. Marlene had figured out that rules, no matter how silly, could be used as tools of control when enforced selectively. The goal wasn't to maintain beauty. The goal was to wear me down until I either complied or cracked. But Marlene hadn't counted on how much I thrived in chaos. The more ridiculous her offenses became, the more entertaining this entire saga grew for the internet. Thanks to a quick edit of my porch cam footage with a dramatic voiceover and soundtrack lifted from an old spy thriller royalty-free site, I uploaded a 2-minute clip titled HOA Agents Infiltrate Beachfront Property. Within hours, it had 30,000 views. People commented with things like, "Release the seagull footage and blink twice if you're trapped in suburbia." A retired film professor offered to help me edit future videos. Someone from Oregon mailed me a handmade sign that read, "Free the porch." But the best part came 2 days later when a small beach publication picked up the story and ran it under the headline, "Seagulls, Brunch, and Tyranny, the South Tide HOA Saga." The accompanying cartoon illustration showed a seagull in a judge's wig holding a scroll that read, "Violation number 7, bad vibes." I printed it and taped it to my kitchen cabinet. Marlene, however, did not appreciate her sudden fame. She stormed into the next HOA meeting, Fumine, declared I was attempting to destabilize the community, and proposed a motion to place a communication gag order on all members regarding ongoing narrative escalations. When one of the newer board members asked what that even meant, Marlene accused him of collusion and had his snack privileges revoked for the quarter. By then, even some of her inner circle were beginning to look tired. Her behavior had gone from strict to surreal. The brunch may have been the spark, but now we were all watching a forest fire, and nobody wanted to roast marshmallows anymore. That night, as I sat on my porch eating fish tacos and watching the tide come in, I noticed a car slow down and stop outside my cabin. It was an older guy in a tan suit leaning against the door with the kinda slow calm that suggested he was used to being ignored until he chose not to be. He introduced himself as Frank Halbert, former HOA president from nearly 20 years ago, long retired but still living up on the North Ridge where the rules didn't reach. He said he'd heard about the incident with Marlene. And after seeing the drone footage and the seagull photo scandal, he decided it was time to pass along something he'd been keeping for years. He handed me a sealed folder labeled Foundation Exceptions and Grandfathered Clauses and said the current board had either forgotten or ignored parts of the original HOA agreement written back when the association was formed. I took the folder with a sense of awe and unease. Inside could be the blueprint for tearing down Marlene's empire. It began like a bad parody of a Martha Stewart special, except with more yelling, more wind, and fewer functioning appliances. Marlene, still rattled from her failure to secure my cabin for her annual brunch, decided the show must go on regardless of venue, optics, or basic logistical coherence. She moved the entire operation 2 cabins down to the home of one of her most loyal disciples, a woman named Beverly, who wore gingham aprons unironically, and owned a miniature schnauzer named Lord Biscuit. Beverly's porch was less of a porch and more of a tilted platform barely able to hold 2 lawn chairs, let alone a full buffet, fold-in tables, and an HOA-approved mimosa station. Yet, they persisted. Invitations went out within 24 hours, handwritten in calligraphy and sealed with faux wax that melted in the mailbox heat and smeared the words into poetic tragedy. Somehow, despite the obvious spatial limitations, Marlene promised this year's event would be bigger and better than ever, a return to values and togetherness, a resurrection of brunch with purpose. It sounded more like a cult sermon than a community gathering, and I watched it unfold from the comfort of my porch hammock, with the detached curiosity of someone observing a very determined yet doomed ant colony building its mound in the path of a lawnmower. The day arrived hot, humid, and breezy enough to lift every paper napkin and decorative placard straight into the neighbors' hydrangeas. Marlene appeared on Beverly's platform in a fuchsia pantsuit, wielding a microphone that screeched every time she introduced someone from the HOA board with overly dramatic flair. One by one, guests began arriving with potluck dishes and confused expressions, each realizing quickly that the scenic coastal backdrop they had anticipated was replaced by a distant glimpse of my cabin, which Marlene had deliberately positioned fold-in chairs to block. That did not, however, stop a handful of guests from wandering toward my property anyway, clutching deviled eggs and unsure whether they were at the wrong address or caught in the middle of a hostage situation. I nodded politely from my hammock and declined the bowl of overcooked mini quiches offered by an elderly man with a pacemaker and no idea what HOA stood for. Meanwhile, Beverly's schnauzer barked at everything that moved, including shadows, leaves, and a rogue crab that wandered too close to the juice cooler. By noon, the brunch was unraveling faster than a clearance rack beach umbrella in a hurricane. The mimosa machine, which Marlene had insisted on renting from a cat errant company she once sued for serving room-temperature salmon, malfunctioned and began spraying sticky orange liquid across the buffet line. One unfortunate woman trying to shield her crochet handbag from the spray slipped and landed in the fruit salad. Someone's toddler pulled the tablecloth from under the dessert tray, launching an avalanche of lemon bars into the air like sugary confetti. Lord Biscuit, since in chaos, bolted from the porch and made a direct sprint toward my property where he promptly squatted and pooped on the exact spot where the seagull had allegedly expired in that staged photo. I took it as a sign, but the real drama came shortly after one of the guests. Mrs. Royston, a retired tax attorney with severe allergies and a reputation for filling grievances over everything from mailbox shapes to unsanctioned solar lights, began coughing violently after taking a bite of a mystery casserole. She accused the chef of poisoning her. The chef accused Marlene of sabotage due to a long-standing grudge about a miscounted HOA vote years prior, and within moments, the brunch had devolved into a full-on shouting match with finger-pointing, food-flinging, and someone yelling about bylaws while brandishing a baguette like a sword. From my porch, I considered streaming it live, but decided to simply record it discreetly for future strategic purposes. The best part was that amid the chaos, a guest climbed onto a cooler to get a better view and accidentally knocked over a tiki torch, which then set the decorative napkin display ablaze. A guest threw her iced tea onto the flames, missed, and soaked Marlene's pantsuit instead. I will never forget the look on her face, drenched, betrayed by citrus, and too proud to flee. Later that evening, the HOA website was quietly scrubbed of all mention of the brunch. No photos were posted. No captions celebrated the event. It was as if it had never happened, but the damage was done. Rumors spread faster than the ants that had discovered the spilled sangria in Beverly's flower bed. People who had previously been loyal to Marlene began whispering doubts. Questions about budget mismanagement, cat errant overspending, and whether the brunch even needed to exist began bubbling to the surface. The word tradition lost some of its magic when paired with wet pantsuits and torch fires. I had done nothing but say no, and yet somehow the entire illusion had collapsed under its own overinflated weight. Still, Marlene wasn't done. Her next move came in the form of a personal visit. She arrived on my porch in full damage control mode, holding a Tupperware of lukewarm banana bread and wearing a fixed smile that made my skin itch. She apologized vaguely for the intrusion last week, said things had simply gotten confused, that everyone missed the previous owner's hospitality, and that she hoped we could find a neighborly compromise moving forward. I listened silently, letting the ocean speak behind her words, watching as she shifted from condescending to pleading to passive-aggressively firm in under 5 minutes. When I said nothing, she tried again. Would I consider hosting next year's brunch? If not the whole brunch, then maybe just the reception, perhaps just the drinks, or maybe she could list the cabin as a sponsored location in the next HOA newsletter. I smiled. I thanked her for the banana bread and told her it would look great on my compost pile. Then I went inside and locked the door. That night, while sipping a cup of tea and reviewing footage of the brunch explosion, I noticed something peculiar. In one of the clips taken from the angle of the crab planter cam, I saw a familiar figure snooping near my utility shed during the height of the chaos. He wasn't part of the brunch. He wasn't even dressed like a guest, just a man in a ball cap and windbreaker, crouching, glancing around, and slipping a small packet into the space behind the cabinet where I'd found the old folders. I froze the frame, zoomed in. It was one of Marlene's nephews, the same one who had posed with the mirror stick days earlier. He had returned, and he had planted something. My mind spun with possibilities. Was it an attempt to frame me? More fake evidence, or something even more manipulative, a forged document, a new bylaw? I would need to investigate, but not yet. First, I needed to meet with Frank again. If the old folders he gave me contained what I thought they did, original foundational rules, overlooked clauses, maybe even sunset provisions, then I had something powerful in my hands, something Marlene couldn't control with brunches, banana bread, or board votes. And so, as the sun dropped beneath the horizon and the tide pulled another secret into the sea, I sat in the flickering light of my porch lantern and began drafting a letter. Not a threat, not a plea, just a simple legal notice of property rights and historical ownership, sit in Clause 7.3 of the original charter. The beach was shifting, and the tide at last was on my side. It was just after sunrise when I stepped barefoot into the cool sand behind my cabin, and felt the faintest crack beneath my heel, the unmistakable brittle snap of paper crushed against wood. I crouched, brushed aside a layer of sea grass, and uncovered a manila envelope shoved deep into the corner where the storage shed met the foundation of the porch. No address, no stamp, just the faint scent of sunscreen and lemon-scented cleaning fluid clinging to the fold. Inside I found a printed page titled Incident Report Property Watch Committee, followed by a list of fabricated violations so egregious and imaginative they bordered on absurdist fiction. According to the document, I had been hosting unregistered guests, storing illicit materials, engaging in unsanctioned business activities involving quote suspicious marine containers, and creating noise disturbances after sunset involving amplified steel drums. I don't even own drums. But Marlene, it seemed, had turned her obsession with brunch into a full-blown attempt to remove me entirely. And now, through this clumsy drop-off, she had tried planting the groundwork for a formal expulsion via the HOA's little-known property morality clause, a vague relic from the early charter that allowed for the temporary freezing of resident privileges in cases of quote behavior disruptive to community cohesion. It had likely never been used because no one sane would take it seriously. But Marlene had never let legality interfere with theatrics. I didn't throw the report away. I added it to the ever-growing stack now kept inside a fireproof box labeled Sun Hat Tactics and began preparing my response. But this time, I wasn't just responding. I was going on the offensive. Frank had agreed to meet me again, this time at a small oceanside cafe that smelled like burnt toast and secrets. He brought a battered 3-ring binder wrapped in what looked like duct tape and a sense of quiet satisfaction. Over coffee, he explained that the original HOA charter had been written not by corporate lawyers or developers, but by a group of local artists, craftsmen, and beach bums who had formed the association to protect the coastline from commercial expansion in the 70s. The rules were poetic, rambling, and filled with contradictions. But one clause stood out. Clause 12.1, the Foundation Property Sanctuary designation stated that any property officially designated as a sanctuary for environmental or creative retreat would be exempt from non-essential board enforcement provided documentation was submitted to the founding registrar. That registrar had been Frank and the poet who once lived in my cabin. She had submitted a handwritten letter and accompanying art installation photo that had indeed designated the cabin as a sanctuary. It was never revoked. Marlene's brunch had not only violated the spirit of the original clause, it had violated the legal stand-in of the property's exemption. In short, my cabin wasn't under her rule. It was protected. It had always been protected, and she'd never bothered to look. I scanned the documents Frank handed me, fingers trembling slightly from the combination of adrenaline and beach cafe caffeine. In the photos, I saw the porch before its repainting with the old wind chimes, the driftwood sculptures, a hand-carved plaque that read, "Silence is not absent." There was even a blurry black and white copy of a local newspaper article about the cabin's original designation as an artist's retreat. Marlene's reign over this property had always been based on ignorance. She ruled through assumption, through pomp, through public performance, but she had no claim here. She had no legal ground beneath her brunch-plated feet. That evening, as the tide pulled in and the wind whipped the porch flags into soft motion, I printed 6 copies of the Sanctuary Clause documentation and mailed them via certified delivery to each HOA board member, including Marlene. I didn't add a note. I didn't need to. I knew it would arrive just in time for the upcoming HOA quarterly meeting, the one she had specifically marked as invitation only and failed to tell me about. I was gonna attend anyway, and I was gonna bring evidence. But before that moment came, something odd happened. A car pulled up outside my cabin one evening just after dark. A silver SUV polished to a mirror's shine out of place among the sand-dusted hatchbacks and sun-faded Jeeps of the neighborhood. A woman stepped out mid-30s in a sharp blazer and flats entirely unsuited for beach terrain. She introduced herself as Trina Maddox, a representative from Coastal Living Quarterly, a lifestyle publication that had caught wind of the HOA drama thanks to the viral brunch footage and a particularly animated tweet storm involving the phrase Brunchgate. She asked if I would be open to an interview. I laughed and told her I wasn't interested in becoming coastal tabloid fodder, but she assured me this wasn't for scandal. It was for a feature on small community resilience. Something about how one resident had unintentionally exposed the rotten foundation of an HOA regime through the simple act of saying no. I agreed reluctantly and invited her inside. Over the next hour, I told her the story from mango slice to manila envelope, and by the end of it, she looked like she'd just binge-watched a thriller. She thanked me, promised to keep the tone respectful, and left with a single photo of me leaning against the porch railing with a coffee cup and a half-smile. The story hit digital shelves 2 days later. The headline was simple and deadly. The cabin that said no, it spread fast, too fast. Residents began leaving copies in the HOA clubhouse, folded open to the center spread. A local artist sketched a cartoon of Marlene holding a brunch tray shaped like a gavel, and someone started a Change.org petition demanding a vote on new leadership. Marlene responded by accusing me of coordinating a smear campaign which only made her seem more paranoid. By the time the quarterly meeting rolled around, there were more people outside the rec hall than inside. Many holding coffee cups with handmade stickers that read, "Protect the porch." I arrived wearing my most neutral shirt and a folder full of history. The room quieted as I entered. Marlene, seated at the front table with 2 of her loyal board members, narrowed her eyes but said nothing. She began the meeting with a speech about unity, decorum, and the dangers of misinformation. When it was time for open comments, I stood. I read aloud from Clause 12.1. I held up the photos. I presented the certified delivery slip. I handed out copies of the original designation letter and the sanctuary exemption. For once, Marlene had no response. Her silence was the sound of a gavel fallen. But the most unexpected moment came from the back of the room. A woman I hadn't seen before in her 60s stood up with a gentle voice and said she had once attended a poetry reading in my cabin 30 years ago. She remembered the original owner. She remembered the wind chimes. She said the cabin had always felt like a place where the noise of the world got quiet. Several others nodded. Even Beverly, whose brunch had collapsed under mimosa chaos, looked away awkwardly. Marlene cleared her throat and said the designation was outdated and perhaps irrelevant, but the room didn't agree. The storm came 3 days after the meeting. Not a metaphorical storm, but a real one. The kind that rushes in from the ocean with its shoulders wide and its breath sharp, slamming against the cabins like it wants to peel the shingles off just to see who flinches. Rain came down in slanted waves, washing sand up into the boardwalk gaps and flooding the streets so that every mailbox looked like it was trying to stay afloat. I watched it from inside, lights dimmed, a mug of tea in one hand and the HOA charter in the other. pages marked with neon tabs like some kind of battle map. The power flickered once, then again, and then held steady. The lights hummin' in that way they only do when the grid is trying to convince itself it won't fail. The wind rattled the windows and the storm shutters screamed once, a loud metallic shriek that echoed through the floorboards. But all I could think about was what Marlene would try next, because people like her never quit. They regroup. They reframe. They build something twisted out of the very debris you thought you buried them under. When the storm broke, the neighborhood staggered outside like survivors blinking into sunlight, dragging out damp towels and busted umbrellas. The sea had taken a few flower beds and returned them with interest in the form of tangled kelp and a stranded inflatable flamingo that no one claimed. My porch had weathered the storm fine, but Marlene's rec center had lost its roof trim, and someone spray painted the phrase "Brunch Tyrant" on the back fence of the clubhouse in what looked like wet charcoal. She claimed vandalism. I claimed karmic wind. A day later, the notices arrived, tucked into every mailbox like poorly wrapped candy canes. A surprise emergency vote scheduled for the upcoming Saturday to reinstate community trust and revisit leadership roles. In HOA language, that meant she was trying to push a vote to reaffirm her presidency before she lost her grip completely. She was using the storm as an emotional play, appealing to people's desire for stability right when they were most waterlogged and exhausted. It was clever, desperate, and dangerous. I didn't wait. I called Frank. We met at his place this time, an angular house up on the ridge that looked like a geometry teacher's daydream. He answered the door holding a tablet already loaded with PDFs. And without a word, he handed me a flash drive and a smirk. On it were all the minutes from past meetings Marlene had quietly scrubbed from the public records, including one from 3 years ago where she promised to step down after her 5th term. That promise, while not legally binned in, was enough to show intention and manipulation. Even better, the files contained an expense ledger from last year's brunch detailing cat errand costs, decor rentals, and a mystery payment labeled beverage consultant. The consultant turned out to be her niece, who had no license, no experience, and whose only known beverage expertise came from once organizing a high school dance. The payment violated 3 separate budget allocation rules and could, if framed correctly, be interpreted as misuse of funds. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a 3-alarm blaze with a neon sign that read, "Look here." I spent the next 48 hours preparing. I printed copies, organized timelines, made bullet points, even though I hated bullet points, and rehearsed a speech in the mirror until it no longer sounded like a plea, but something colder, something that landed with the weight of inevitability. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzzed. People whispered on porches, paused longer at the mailbox, leaned in closer at dog-walking intersections. Something was shifting. You could feel it. Even the air seemed less controlled, like it no longer obeyed Marlene's carefully manicured winds. Saturday came hot and full of tension. The meeting was held in the community rec center, patched but not fully repaired, and it smelled like damp carpet and citrus cleaner. Chairs were arranged in rows, the middle ones already filled with Marlene's usual suspects, the loyalists with their pressed clothes and pursed lips. But around the edges, more and more people stood. People who had never bothered attending before, people who were tired of rules that shifted like dunes and expectations that bent only one way. I arrived 10 minutes early, carrying my folder and wearing the same neutral shirt from the last meeting, now becoming something of a talisman. Marlene stood at the front, posture perfect, smile strained. She called the meeting to order with her usual forced cheer, thanked everyone for coming together after such a difficult week, and began talking about continuity, vision, and the need to maintain leadership through difficult times. Her voice tried to sound firm, but it wavered near the edges, and every time she looked at me, her eyes flicked downward, as if checking her footing on a crumbling ledge. When she opened the floor for community comments, I waited. Let the silence stretch. Let the tension thicken. Then I stood. I thanked the board. I acknowledged the storm. Then I began. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply read. Clause after clause, meetin' after meetin'. I laid out the timeline of promises made and broken, funds misused, and rules twisted. I handed out copies of receipts, pointed out the consultant payment, referenced the sanctuary clause again for good measure. I reminded them all that leadership isn't about holding a position, but honoring a purpose. And when I finished, I sat down. No drama, just documentation. Then something I hadn't planned happened. Mrs. Higgs, the chicken-owning neighbor who had once left me a pie with a note that said, "Sorry about the drone," stood up. She said she'd lived in the community for 30 years. That she remembered when the HOA was about gardens and garbage days, not brunches and surveillance. She said she liked her chickens. She said she liked my porch. And then she asked very calmly when we all stopped being neighbors and started being subjects. The room was silent. Then someone clapped, then someone else. And suddenly the room was loud with it. Not polite applause, but something real, something tired and grateful. Marlene tried to regain control, calling for order, but her voice was lost in the tide. The vote was taken by secret ballot. Quick, simple, binned in. The results were read by the treasurer, who looked pale and unusually sweaty. 52% voted to initiate a leadership review. Enough to trigger a special election. Enough to force Marlene to step down until the vote could be completed. She stood there blinking, her clipboard trembling, then turned and left without a word. The door shut behind her with a softness that felt louder than any slam. Outside, the sky was clear, the wind gentle, the air smelling of salt, and the faint burn of old lemon-scented power. People stood in clusters, not as factions, but just as people. Someone handed out popsicles. Someone else brought out folding chairs. It didn't feel like the end of a war. It felt like the beginning of something quieter. I walked home slow, folder under my arm, nodding at every neighbor who smiled and nodded back. The porch waited as always, sturdy and wide, sun-warmed and simple. I sat with my feet on the rail, the wind chimes barely stirring, and I thought about how all of this started. A brunch, a boundary. It should have ended there with the vote, with the soft slam of the rec center door, and the slow unraveling of Marlene's power. But people like her don't go quietly. And in the days that followed the so-called leadership review, it became clear that Marlene wasn't just licking her wounds. She was sharpening her next move in silence. At first there was calm, almost suspiciously so, as if the entire community had taken a collective breath and was holding it, waiting to see whether the worst was truly over, or if the eye of the storm had simply passed. I filled my time with porch repairs, rewiring one of the cameras tucked in a ceramic gull after a particularly brave raccoon dislodged it, and watching from a distance as the HOA scrambled to form an interim committee. There were whispered suggestions that I should run for the presidency, that I had earned it, that I would restore sanity, but I waved them off. I hadn't fought this long to trade my mornings for board meetings, or my peace for policy. I didn't want a podium. I wanted my porch, my tide, my mangoes, and maybe a few neighbors who didn't spy with drones or serve subpoenas inside bundt cakes. But peace never lasts long in places where image matters more than truth. The first sign that Marlene wasn't done came not with a knock or a letter, but with a package left on my steps, brown paper wrap pin, no return address. Inside was a flash drive and a typed note that simply read, "Thought you should see this." That's it. No signature, no threats, just those 5 words. I took it inside and plugged it into a laptop I rarely used. One I kept disconnected from everything important just in case. The drive contained a folder labeled HOA tapes and inside dozens of recordings, screen captures, and email PDFs. Most of it was surveillance footage, grainy clips of Marlene in board meetings, Marlene in private phone calls that had been recorded without her knowledge. Marlene making side deals with contractors, instructing her nephew to falsify documentation, dismissing complaints with an eye roll and a joke about power being the only perk that mattered in a community like this. There were emails, too. One especially damning one where she instructed the board secretary to delete the sanctuary clause minutes from the digital archive and to replace them with a rewritten summary. But the worst came near the end. A video recording of her at her dining table speaking to someone off-screen and saying, "If I can't control the board, I'll control the ballot. I'll rig it if I have to." These people don't read fine print. They read brunch menus. I sat frozen, watching her words hang in the room like smoke. The flash drive was a grenade, and someone had just placed it carefully into my lap. I knew instantly that releasing the contents would obliterate whatever remained of her public image, that even the loyalists would scatter once the recordings were heard. But I also knew it wasn't that simple. Whoever had sent it wasn't doing it for justice. Not entirely. They were watching, calculating, waiting for a reaction. It was bait, perhaps meant to entrap me, or perhaps a test to see if I would go nuclear. I copied the contents, locked the originals in my safe, and made 3 duplicates, which I gave to Frank, Mrs. Higgs, and the treasurer who had read the vote results. Then I waited, and sure enough, 2 days later, a new flyer appeared across the neighborhood, taped to mailboxes, stapled to phone poles, even tucked into beach umbrellas. It was slickly printed, full color, and headlined "Emergency Candidate Nomination Reinstatement Petition for Marlene Withers." She was running again. Not just running, but fast-tracking the process using an obscure clause that allowed for an emergency re-election if community trust was deemed destabilized. The signature list on the back had 32 names, some real, some likely forged, and at the bottom, a paragraph stating that any candidate running against her must submit their declaration within 48 hours or forfeit the position by default. It was legal. It was dirty. It was pure Marlene. I didn't hesitate. I wrote my name on a form I had hoped never to touch, walked it to the interim chair's mailbox, and went home. If she wanted a final act, I would give her one, but it wouldn't go the way she planned. The next 48 hours were a blur. I didn't campaign. I didn't pass out flyers. I didn't knock on doors. Instead, I waited until the community forum the night before the vote. I asked for 15 minutes to speak. They gave me 10. I plugged in a projector, played the video of Marlene's off-screen confession, and said nothing while the room reacted. Gasps, murmurs, a cough, then silence. I ended my presentation with a single sentence. You deserve a president who values truth more than table settings. The next morning, the voting station looked like a festival. People lined up in sandals and sun hats, muttering, gossiping. But there was a new mood in the air, a kind of relief, as if a pressure valve had finally been released. I stood at the edge, nodding, not campaigning, just present. Marlene arrived late, flanked by 2 of her nephews, and wearing a pastel suit that looked stiff and oddly damp, like it had been steamed into submission. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't have to. The whispers moved faster than she could. By noon, the results were clear. I had won by a landslide. Not just by votes, but by sentiment, by exhaustion, by the sheer collective craving for something, anything that didn't smell like weaponized brunch. I was handed the ceremonial binder, a thick leather monstrosity that contained years of meeting notes, signatures, and legal records. I took it with both hands, looked around the room, and then handed it back to the treasurer. I decline, I said. I will not be president. I came here for the sound of the waves and the silence between them, not for power, not for policy. I suggest we elect someone who actually wants to serve. And with that, I left. No fanfare, no speech, just me and my sandals crunching back across the gravel toward a porch that had been waiting for me all along. But as I approached, I saw a figure sitting there. Not Marlene, not Frank, a boy, maybe 17, with a hoodie and a nervous energy. He stood as I neared, handed me a folded paper, and said quietly, "I thought you should know." Then he left. Inside the paper was a screenshot of an email. It was from Marlene to her son. The timestamp was from 3 months ago. It read, "He's more dangerous than he looks. Smart, quiet, manipulative, like a lawyer with a tan. If he pushes me out, I'm talking the files. He doesn't know I have access to the old beach rights registry." One signature in his porch becomes community property again. Let's see how he likes brunch, then. My breath caught. The beach rights registry was a dusty, often forgotten pile of legal threads that tied coastal property to shifting sand ownership, ancient deeds, and poorly worded state laws. If Marlene had found a loophole there, it could explain her obsession. Maybe my cabin wasn't just personal to her. Maybe it held leverage. But why would her son leak this now? Why deliver it to me anonymously? And what did he mean by files? The paper weighed nothing in my pocket, but it dragged at every step I took back up to the porch like a stone tied to memory. I unfolded it again, even though I'd already read it a dozen times, each word soaking deeper with every reread until the ink felt etched behind my eyes. It was a simple screenshot, but the implication was anything but simple. Marlene had found something in the old beach rights registry, something she believed gave her the power to revoke my private property designation and reclassify the land beneath my cabin as community-owned. It was an obscure tactic, risky, and wildly controversial, but not entirely impossible. Coastal law, especially in legacy beach communities like ours, was a tangle of loopholes, grandfathered clauses, and forgotten deeds buried in file cabinets that hadn't seen light since disco was in style. What struck me wasn't just that she knew about it. It was that she had planned to use it. And if her son had turned against her enough to slip this into my hand, it meant she had likely crossed a line even her family couldn't stomach anymore. I spent the next several hours buried in documents. The files Frank had given me, the scanned PDFs I'd pulled from archived records, even the brittle photocopies left behind in the shed by the poet who once called this porch home. Somewhere in all that legal dust, I needed to find what Marlene had found and neutralize it. And just after midnight, I did. It was a clause buried in a 1974 zoning addendum written in dense legalese and stapled to the back of a registration form for coastal event permit. It stated that beachfront properties without a permanent retaining wall and a registered commercial boundary could be considered part of the community trust during periods of low tide reversion, provided the original deed did not declare a private claim of perpetual anchorage. The phrasing was archaic, overly poetic, and clearly written before people started using words like easement and subdivision with any precision. But it left a window open, a technicality that, under certain interpretations, could be used to argue that my porch, built on stilts over shifting sand, was not part of the land, but merely part of the environment, a structure without root, a house without ground. It was nonsense. But in the wrong hands, nonsense can become leverage. So I did the only thing that made sense. I built a wall. Not a dramatic concrete barrier or a picket fence monstrosity, but a tasteful low stone retaining line at the back edge of the property, just enough to legally mark the boundary. I filed the permit first thing in the morning, took photos of the wall mid-construction, and filed those, too. I stamped the paperwork, notarized it, and walked it into the county zoning office myself. Where the clerk behind the desk raised an eyebrow and said, "Haven't seen one of these forms in years." I nodded and said, "Better late than litigated." When I left, I called Frank, updated him, and asked him to log everything into our run-in timeline. By noon the next day, I had not only plugged the hole Marlene had planned to crawl through, I'd bricked it shut, poured concrete in the cracks, and planted a lemon tree on top for good measure. But Marlene still had one card left to play. That afternoon, the interim HOA board received an anonymous complaint. A motion was filed stating that I had used personal influence and intimidation to secure my victory and that my refusal to accept the presidency was a manipulative tactic designed to destabilize leadership. It was a desperate move, thin and flailin', but enough to trigger a special hearing. The board, now led by a nervous and overworked secretary named Randall, scheduled the session for Saturday and requested I attend to clear the matter. I agreed, but only after requesting a formal transcript of the complaint. What I received confirmed everything. The wording matched Marlene's cadence perfectly. Her old phrases, her dramatic flourishes, her trademark sentence structure. It was her hiding behind an anonymous label like a child pretending to be invisible beneath a bedsheet. I spent the next 2 days preparing not a rebuttal, but a demonstration. Saturday arrived bright and breezy, the kind of day postcards lie about, and the meeting was held once again in the rec center, now smelling faintly of sawdust and cheap victory. Marlene wasn't there, at least not at first. I walked in, greeted Randall, and requested the floor. I didn't bring a folder this time. I brought a TV, a large flat screen wheeled in on a borrowed dolly, and plugged into the wall. Randall blinked. The crowd shifted. I played a video, security footage from a week prior, showing Marlene sneaking around my retaining wall at night, measuring it with a tape, and whispering into her phone. Then I played a second clip, audio enhanced, of her telling someone, "We'll file the complaint under someone else's name. Use Randall's nerves against him. He'll panic and call the meeting." The room didn't gasp. It exhaled as if the air had been holding its breath this whole time. I turned off the TV, looked directly at Randall, and said, "I'm not your enemy, but I'm not your puppet either. There was no vote, no motion, just silence, and the slow collective understanding that whatever Marlene had built over the years had now crumbled completely, its final bricks kicked loose by her own son, her own voice, her own overreach. The meeting dissolved quietly. Some stayed behind to talk in small circles. Others left without a word. I stood for a while outside, letting the sea breeze push against my back, the sun warm in my arms, and the voices of my neighbors fading into something soft and unthreatening. No one shouted, no one made demands. For the first time in months, it was just quiet. Honest quiet. That evening, I returned to my cabin and found a single envelope tucked beneath the wind chimes. It was from Marlene. No return address, just my name written in handwritten I recognized too well. Inside a note, 4 words. You win. I'm done. I stared at it, turned it over, half expecting a catch, a hidden clause, a coded insult, but there was nothing. No threats, no conditions, just those words. I placed the note in the safe with everything else. Let the record show, I said to no one, that sometimes the end arrives not with thunder, but with surrender. The next morning, the neighborhood changed, not with trumpets or banners, but in small human ways. Someone painted their mailbox teal. Someone else hosted a coffee hour on their porch. Randall sent a memo asking 4 ideas to simplify the bylaws. Mrs. Higgs installed a little wooden sign on her chicken coop. That red piece enforced by poultry. And me, I went back to my porch, coffee in hand, sea breeze on my face, no clipboard in sight. I didn't win because I fought. I won because I outlasted, outread. Marlene had built an empire of brunches and bylaws. I had built a porch, and in the end, it stood taller. But just as I leaned back into the hammock, the sun warmed my toes and the distant waves murmuring their approval, I felt my phone buzz with a message from Frank. 1 line. You might want to check the property map. It's been updated. I sat up, heart suddenly hammering. I opened the zone in sight, pulled up the map.